So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about plants. And whenever I'm thinking about plants, I like to think about them in terms of their evolutionary adaptations to living on um, terrestrial ecosystems. So when plants first came about, they lived entirely in the oceans, and ultimately they evolved to live on soil or on Earth, basically. And when you think about living on a terrestrial ecosystem, there's certain challenges that exist that don't exist if you just live in the water. And that's how I like to think about plants, and that's how we're going to be going through this section. So what do plants have to deal with on land that they didn't have to deal with in the water? Well, for one thing, they have to worry about drying out. That's a really big deal. Living in really dry environments. They have to worry about dealing with the impacts of gravity. They have to worry about how do we move our gametes around. And so we're going to be discussing all of these in terms of their adaptations. So we're going to talk about meristems, which give plants the ability to grow in different directions. We're going to talk about the alternation of generations that plants undergo, which is a really big deal and can be kind of confusing, so make sure that you're paying attention to that one. And within that category, I'm going to want you to know about the sporophyte and gametophyte generation. If you don't know what that means, don't worry, we're going to get there. We're also going to talk about seedless plants and how they try to survive on Earth. We're going to talk about seed plants, and when we get to that category, I want you to know the difference between an angiosperm, or a flowering plant, and a gymnosperm, which is things like conifers and ginkgos. And again, we're going to get there. And then we're going to talk about the angiosperms specifically. This is sort of the most evolved or most modern form of plants that we have. And when we get there, I want you to know the difference between monoecious and dioecious, or monoecious and dioecious, depending on who you're talking to. And I'm also going to ask you to know the basic outline of some flower parts. So let's go into it. And so, as the book says, plants are a pretty big deal for us. They're kind of everywhere, and they play a really big deal in human societies. You eat plants every single day. Try to walk outside and not. So meristematic cells are kind of like stem cells from plants in that they can become anything. So a meristem cell can become a shoot, it can become a root, it can become a leaf, it can become bark. The difference is that stem cells are used up, whereas meristematic cells can replicate and do not get used up in the same way that stem cells do. Apical meristem gives rise to new shoots and new roots. In fact, there are several different kinds of meristem and meristematic cells. Shoot apical meristems, which cause new shoots, root apical meristem, which cause new roots, and then lateral meristems, which undergo what's called secondary growth, which results ultimately in bark. But the main thing that I want you to know is that meristem cells can become anything, and they are the mechanism, they are how plants grow. So now we're getting into the alternation of generations. So we talked about sexual reproduction and what it's for, and if you don't remember, sexual reproduction is to just increase diversity. It's to make your population have different alleles mixed up. The book also discusses asexual reproduction and its advantages. So with asexual reproduction, you don't have to find a mate. You don't have to wait around for a mate to show up. Also, mates can be potentially very, very destructive to you and your health. So asexual reproduction allows you to just make a copy of yourself. In asexual reproduction, you also don't have to lose any of your genetics. You get to pass those all down to the next generation. And so instead of your offspring just being half of you, they're all of you. So alternation of generation allows plants to kind of use both of these, and depending on which one is more advantageous at the time, it could be emphasized. But anyway, let's talk about this really quick. So we're going to start off with the diploid version here, the sporophyte. You should know that sporophytes are diploid. And what happens is the sporophyte is ultimately going to undergo meiosis. Okay? After it undergoes meiosis, hopefully you remember that it becomes haploid. It makes things that have half of the genetic information required. those spores that are created from meiosis are going to land on the ground and make gametophytes. Okay? And those gametophytes are generally either going to be male or female, and they are going to make gametes. After those gametes get back together, this says fusion, but you can think about this as fertilization. They're going to form a zygote, which is going to regrow into a sporophyte. And what makes this unique in plants is that plants actually have a large portion of their life cycle that they spend as haploid. You have a portion of your life cycle that you spend as haploid, but you aren't actually like a multicellular organism that's sort of out there in the world. You're just a sperm or an egg, and an egg inside of your parents' bodies, right? But plants actually have a separate haploid part of their life cycle that is completely separate and free living. So here is just a picture of alternation of generations with a dominant sporophyte. And so this is a fern, and they did something kind of mean here, and they flipped it upside down. So in the previous slide, haploid was on top. In this slide, haploid's on the bottom now. So just be kind of aware of that. This works in the same sort of way. We'll start with the sporophyte. Again, this is what you're most familiar with. When you see a fern, this is what you're expecting to see. And that sporophyte generates those spores, okay, by undergoing meiosis. Those spores land on the ground and they form this thing here, which is the haploid gametophyte. So in ferns, the gametophyte actually has both male and female parts. And I'm not worried about, the book talks about terms like archegonia and antheridia. You don't necessarily need to worry about those. But you should know that the gametophyte is going to create gametes. Okay, it's going to create sperm and it's going to create eggs. And when those two fuse or fertilize, the sperm fertilizes the egg, it creates a zygote, which grows back into the ferns that we all know and love. And again, the fern is going to create spores, which will land on the ground and hopefully grow a gametophyte, which will create gametes, and the cycle continues. So plants are able to alternate through these generations. And as we'll see, as plants become more and more evolved, the alternation of generation actually becomes diminished. So once you get to things like angiosperms, the gametophyte stage is much, much more reduced. But this is something that all plants undergo, is this alternation of sexual and not sexual. I mean, yeah. This is something that all plants undergo, this alternation of sexual and asexual stages. Here's just another life cycle, which is kind of showing you the same process with the dominant gametophyte. And I think they flipped them again on you. No, okay, haploid is still on the bottom here. And your gametophyte here is, it's going to generate your gametes, and in this particular case, the male and female are separate organisms. But once fertilization takes place, you regenerate your sporophyte, which is going to make, so the sporophyte in this case is going to grow directly out of the gametophyte, and it's going to make spores, which again, hopefully, will land on the ground and grow a new gametophyte, and the process can start. Here you have your sporophyte growing out of the top, and the bottom green part is the gametophyte. So again, these things are going to release those spores, which are going to go land on the ground and grow new gametophytes. Here's a picture of a hornwort sporophyte. So I just wanted to show you, this is a table that shows you the divisions of modern plants. Okay, so these are the non-vascular plants that we call the bryophytes. These are non-monophyletic, so you cannot put these all together easily on a monophyletic tree. But these things do not have vascular tissue. Vascular tissue is basically how plants bring water up through their roots, make nutrients in the leaves or make sugars in the leaves, and then bring those sugars back down. So these plants have no vascular tissue whatsoever, and so they have to live in pretty moist environments. Then, over here we have our vascular plants. Vascular plants can be broken down into seedless plants and seed plants. The seedless plants you're probably most familiar with are horsetails and ferns. Certain mosses fall within these categories, but you don't need to know pterophyte or lycophyte. You just need to know that there are plants that lack seeds entirely. We also have the seed plants, which consist of gymnosperms. That's things like conifers, ginkgos, cycads, neophytes. And we have angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. All right. So again, we have non-vascular plants, bryophytes. We have vascular plants, which are broken down into seedless plants and seed plants. And under seed plants, we have gymnosperms and we have angiosperms. So I just wanted to throw this up here so you could see kind of what the evolutionary trajectory of this looks like. So remember how I said that our bryophytes were non-monophyletic? You can see here that you can't, this represents what's called a polytomy, but basically what this is saying is that these things aren't super closely related to one another necessarily. They all just don't have vascular tissue. Then you have your seedless plants and your seed plants, which again break down into gymnosperms, which is your conifers, your pine trees, your Christmas trees, basically, and your angiosperms, which are your flowering plants. So if you're talking about seedless plants like these horsetails, they tend to live in places where there's more moisture available and where complete dryness is pretty rare. And so the reason for that is if you have a portion of your life cycle that exists within a seed, you can prevent drying out. So if you're a tree, you can drop your seeds, and let's say you can drop your seeds in spring, and then in summer everything gets really dry. That seed is going to be able to survive. If you're a plant that lacks seeds, you're not going to be able to survive because everything's going to be super, super dried out. Okay, so seeds as an adaptation for plants are to help them to be able to cope with desiccation. Okay, that's a fantastic test question, actually. Seeds are to help plants be able to deal with completely drying out. And seedless plants are generally going to grow in places that are wetter. This is the life cycle of a conifer. I'm not really as concerned with this. But basically what happens is your pollen from your male cones, so yeah, that's why I showed this, okay. So male cones are generally very small, and female cones are the large cones. When you see a pine cone, you're most likely looking at a female cone. That's the ones that we're all used to calling just cones. Okay, male cones are very small. They contain pollen, and the pollen is just the male gamete, and the male cones are going to fertilize the female cones, which are going to generate a whole bunch of seeds inside that large female cone structure. So another adaptation that conifers have to living in the cold is most of them have developed needles, and needles allow them to be able to have snow land on them without having them get super, super weighed down. Also here is the idea of deciduousness. So most conifers are what's called evergreen, which means that they have their pine needles all winter throughout the entire year. The reason a plant might lose its leaves in the winter or in the fall is because there's not as much sunlight. And so what the plants are doing is they're hibernating until the next year comes around, and then there's a reason for them to have leaves. There's a reason for them to attempt to photosynthesize, because it's really dark in the winter most of that time. So why spend all this energy having and maintaining these leaves when you're not actually going to get that much energy from them? And so, interestingly, certain conifers are actually deciduous. In fact, there's a fantastic example at MJC. It's a tree called the dawn redwood, which loses its pine needles every year, and people always think that it has died, but no, it's just a super cool deciduous tree that most people think is evergreen. And finally, sort of the last stop or the most recent stop on our evolutionary train is the flowering plants. These are angiosperms. And these flowers form so that they can attract insects or birds or whatever pollinators so that they can actually spread their gametes around to other plants. So here is a picture of a flower, and this is what's called a perfect flower, meaning that it has both male and female organs. And so you can see, I'd like you to know here, you don't need to know gynecium or anything. I would like you to know that the stigma, style, and ovary, which make up what's called the carpel, are the female parts of the flower. So if you have if you're looking at the female parts, or if you're looking at the stigma, style, and ovary, you're looking at the female parts. You should also know that the anther and filament, which make up the stamen of the flower, are the male parts. So I'll probably put some kind of picture up on the exam and say, you know, is this an anther? Is it a filament? Is this the male part? Is this the female part? So monoecious plants, monoecious meaning one house, have both male and female parts on the same flower or on the same plant. Dioecious plants, or two houses, they have separate reproductive structures. So you're going to, in a dioecious plant, you're going to have a male plant and you're going to have a female plant. Again, monoecious plants, female and male on the same flower or on the same plant, and dioecious plants where you have two separate male and female types. So for instance, ginkgo trees are dioecious. You can have a female ginkgo tree, and if you don't have any male trees near that female tree, it's never going to get fertilized. You can also have a male tree. They exist separately. They are dioecious. Whereas with a monoecious plant, they can actually self-fertilize, which, by the way, that's what Gregor Mendel was working with. His pea plants were monoecious because they had both male and female parts within one flower. So here's just some crops that we get from flowering plants, things like rice and beans, and we also, you know, really enjoy the beauty of things like lilies and daisies.